Right now, somewhere within a few blocks of where you're sitting, there's a rose bush that looks like it belongs on the cover of a gardening magazine. Massive blooms, deep green canes arching in every direction, that unmistakable fragrance drifting across the yard every time a breeze moves through. And the person who planted it? They have no real idea what they're doing. They water it when they remember. They've never so much as glanced at their soil pH. They prune it with the same logic they use on every other shrub in the garden. A little off the top in spring. Call it a day. They probably can't even tell you the name of the variety because they grabbed it from a big box store on impulse one weekend and shoved it in the ground between two other things. And yet there it sits, a spectacle, 100 blooms at once, coming back thicker and taller every single year, as if the whole concept of struggle doesn't apply to it. Meanwhile, you may have bought a rose, maybe one of those gorgeous English shrub roses with the cup-shaped petals, or a classic deep red hybrid tea, and planted it with genuine care. You followed the directions. You watered it, fed it something from the garden shelf, maybe staked the canes, and still watched it turn yellow by midsummer. Fewer leaves every week, blooms that never fully opened, or stopped coming after the first flush. And then, quietly, without drama, it just gave up and never came back. Here's what nobody tells you at the checkout counter, and what none of the care tags tucked into the pot actually say. Roses are not difficult. They have that reputation, and it's completely undeserved. The truth is that almost everything that kills a rose comes down to a very specific set of mistakes, the kind that are easy to make once and easy to stop making forever once someone actually explains what's happening underneath the surface. This plant has been growing wild on every continent except Antarctica for millions of years. It survived before fertilizer existed, before irrigation, before anyone thought to deadhead it or give it a name. The cultivated roses in your garden are a few steps removed from that wildness, yes, but the survival instinct is still in there. Once you stop working against it and start working with it, roses become one of the most rewarding and forgiving plants in any garden. I'm going to give you 6 secrets today. Not the vague, recycled advice that fills every gardening article. Plant in full sun, water regularly, prune in spring. You already know that. I mean the specific, lesser-known knowledge that separates the gardener with the show-stopping rosebush from everyone else on the block. The kind of information that changes the way you actually see and interact with this plant. Stay with me through all 6, but especially through secret number 4, because that one single piece of information explains why most roses die in their first 2 or 3 years, and the vast majority of gardeners never hear it until they've already made the mistake 3 or 4 times over. By the end of this video, you'll understand roses better than people who've been growing them for 20 years without ever digging into the why. Let's get into it. Number 1. Plant the bud union below the soil, not at it. Every rose you buy from a nursery or garden center, unless it's a species rose or one grown on its own roots, is actually 2 plants fused together into one. There's the ornamental variety on top, the one with the beautiful blooms you paid for, and there's a separate, tougher rootstock underneath, chosen purely for its vigorous, resilient root system rather than its flowers. These 2 plants are joined at a point called the bud union, which usually appears as a swollen, slightly knobby junction right at the base of the canes, just where they emerge from the roots. You've probably seen it without knowing what it was. Here's the problem. Most gardeners plant their roses exactly the way they'd plant any other perennial. They match the soil surface in the pot to the soil surface in the ground. Neat, logical, and for most plants, completely correct. But for roses, this approach leaves that bud union sitting right at or even slightly above ground level. And that's a setup for a specific kind of long-term fragility that will follow your plant through every winter and every heat spike for as long as it lives. The bud union is the most cold-sensitive point on a rose. It's the hinge point between the root system and the growing plant, and when it's exposed at the surface of the soil, it's vulnerable in ways that matter enormously. A hard frost can damage it outright. A stretch of hot, dry weather in July can stress it. A careless swing of a hoe or a foot placed slightly wrong while weeding can nick it. And damage to the bud union doesn't show up immediately. It shows up weeks or months later as unexplained weakness, dieback, or the sudden appearance of what are called suckers, canes growing from below the graft that belong to the rootstock variety, not the ornamental one you wanted. The fix is simple but feels slightly counterintuitive. Bury the bud union 1 to 2 inches below the soil surface. This is the planting depth standard for most of the country, anywhere that gets real winters. You're not burying the whole plant deeper than comfortable. You're specifically positioning that one critical point under the protection of the soil itself. Why does this matter so much? A buried bud union stays at a much more stable temperature than one sitting at the surface. The soil insulates it from frost and from heat spikes. It stays moister, it stays protected from physical damage, and that stability translates directly into resilience. The rose is less stressed, which means it puts its energy into growing and blooming, instead of constantly recovering from damage you can't even see. But here's the part that turns this from a good tip into an essential one. When the bud union is buried and the whole plant is planted slightly deeper, you create a situation where new canes can emerge from that protected underground zone, even if everything above ground is killed. A winter that strips every visible cane back to nothing isn't the end of the rose. The root system and the bud union are sitting in insulated, protected soil, and come spring, new growth can push up from that point, as if the whole disaster never happened. There's even a longer-term benefit that most people never mention. When certain varieties are planted deeply enough and left in place for many years, the ornamental canes can begin throwing their own roots from below the graft. The rose gradually transitions from depending on the rootstock to being truly self-rooted. At that point, you have a plant that is dramatically more vigorous, more disease-resistant, and more long-lived than the same variety planted at pot level. Some of the oldest, most spectacular garden roses you'll ever see, the ones that have been climbing over outbuildings and consuming entire fences for 30 or 40 years, started this journey with someone planting them just a little deeper than the directions said. Practically, when you plant a rose, dig your hole 2 to 3 inches deeper than the root ball requires. Set the plant in. Check that the bud union will sit roughly 1 to 2 inches below your final soil level, and backfill. That depth decision takes about 10 extra seconds. Its effects last decades. Number 2. Train the roots down, not out. This is the secret that determines whether your roses look fine or look extraordinary, and it comes down entirely to how and when you water them. Most gardeners water their roses the way they water everything else, frequently, at the surface, for a few minutes at a time. The soil at the base of the plant looks consistently moist. The rose doesn't appear to be drying out. From the outside, everything seems okay. But underground, a quiet problem is building that will make your rose weaker every single season, rather than stronger. Here's what's happening. When you water frequently and shallowly, skimming the top inch or two of soil with moisture on a regular basis, the roots follow the water. Plant roots grow toward moisture. If moisture is always in the top couple of inches, that's where the roots live. Over a season or two, your rose develops a dense, shallow root system right at the surface. a mat of fine roots sitting in the most temperature-volatile, most drought-prone zone of your entire garden. Shallow roots have two very specific vulnerabilities that eventually catch up with every rose grown this way. The first is heat. The top few inches of soil are directly exposed to sun, and in July, that layer can reach temperatures that are genuinely damaging to root tissue. While the air temperature in the shade might be in the upper 80s, the surface soil temperature can climb well above 100 degrees. Roots living in that zone aren't just uncomfortable, they're under serious physiological stress. The rose responds by sacrificing leaves, producing smaller blooms, and generally diverting energy away from growth into just managing the heat. You water more, which cools the surface briefly, but the roots can't escape. The second vulnerability is drought. The top layer of soil also dries out faster than any other zone. After a rain, the deep soil holds moisture for days, sometimes more than a week. But the surface? It can be bone dry within 24 hours in summer heat. A rose with surface roots runs out of accessible water almost immediately between waterings. A rose with deep roots is drawing on a completely different reservoir. Cooler, more stable, slower to deplete. The fix is to change the rhythm and depth of how you water. And the principle couldn't be simpler. Water slowly, deeply, and less often rather than quickly, shallowly, and frequently. In practice, this means when you water for a long time. A soaker hose coiled around the base of the rose and left on for 40 minutes does something fundamentally different from 5 minutes with a handheld hose. The slow, steady flow gives the water time to percolate downward rather than running off horizontally. Your goal is to push moisture 6 to 8 inches down into the soil, deep enough that the roots below that level can reach it. If you're not sure whether you're achieving this, the check is simple. After watering, push a finger or a thin trowel several inches into the soil near the base of the rose. Where does the moisture stop? If it stops at 2 inches, your watering isn't reaching the root zone of a healthy, established rose. Aim to push it deeper. Once you make this switch, the root system follows over the course of a season or two. Roots grow toward consistent moisture, and if that moisture is consistently 6, 8, 10 inches down, that's where they go. You end up with a rose that has its most critical root tissue in cool, stable, moisture-retaining soil, which means it handles heat waves, mist waterings, and drought stretches that would devastate a shallowly rooted plant. There's one more layer to this that connects it to the very first secret. When the bud union is planted slightly below the surface and the roots are deep, the whole underground system of the rose is operating in a protected, stable environment. Root zone temperature stays lower. Moisture stays more consistent. The stress load on the plant drops substantially, and a low-stress rose is a forgiving rose, one that can handle a week of neglect, a stretch of brutal heat, or a missed feeding without immediately showing it in the blooms. Water deep, water less often. Let the roots find their way down, and they will do the rest. Number 3. Know what kind of rose you have before you ever pick up the pruning shears. Here's where a significant percentage of rose failures happen. Not from disease, not from bad weather, not from pests, but from a gardener picking up a pair of loppers at the wrong moment and removing every single bloom the plant had been building toward for 6 months. The plant survives, it just has nothing to show for an entire growing season, and the gardener, standing there with a pile of clippings and a completely flowerless rose, concludes that something is wrong with the plant, the garden, the climate, or themselves. Almost nothing is wrong. The timing was wrong. That's it. Roses fall into 2 fundamentally different camps when it comes to how and when they bloom, and those two camps require almost opposite approaches to pruning. The first group is once-blooming roses. These include most of the old garden roses, gallicas, albas, centifolias, damasks, a large number of climbers and ramblers. They do exactly what the name says. They bloom once a year, in late spring or early summer, in one concentrated, spectacular flush. After that flush, they don't rebloom. But here's the critical piece. These roses bloom on old wood, growth that was produced during the previous season and sat on the plant through the winter and into spring, quietly accumulating energy for that one big performance. When you cut into that old wood in early spring, before it's had the chance to bloom, you've pruned off this year's entire flower show. The plant won't die. It will put on new growth and look reasonably healthy. But come early summer, when it should be covered in flowers, it will have nothing to offer because you removed the only wood capable of producing them. With once-blooming roses, the pruning window is after they've finished blooming, late June or into July in most climates. You let them go, you enjoy the whole show. And then, after the petals have fallen and the plant is winding down, you do your shaping. Remove crossing canes. Take out anything that's genuinely dead or weak. Give the plant its structure. The new growth that emerges after this summer pruning is exactly what will carry next year's blooms. The second group is repeat blooming roses, and this covers most of the roses sold today. Modern hybrid teas, floribundas, grandifloras, most English roses, most miniatures, and a huge range of contemporary shrub roses all fall here. These bloom on new wood, growth produced in the current season. The more new, vigorous growth you encourage, the more bloom cycles you get. And you encourage that growth by pruning hard in late winter or very early spring, cutting the plant back significantly before it wakes up for the season. Some growers go down to knee height or lower. It looks alarming. What comes back is dense, vigorous, flower-ready new growth that carries bloom after bloom from late spring all the way into autumn. So how do you figure out what you have without a botany degree? The most reliable signal is bloom timing and pattern. If your rose has one glorious flush in late spring or early summer and then stops, it's almost certainly once blooming. If it keeps cycling, blooming, taking a short break to set new buds, blooming again, all summer and into fall, it's repeat blooming. The second method is to look up the name. Most roses sold with any kind of tag have a variety name on them, and a quick search of that name will tell you immediately which group it belongs to. The third method, and this is your insurance policy when you genuinely have no idea, is to do almost nothing in the first year. In early spring, remove only what is clearly, completely dead. Dry brown canes with no signs of life. Leave everything else untouched. Watch the plant bloom. Note when it blooms. Note whether it reblooms. By the end of that first full season, you'll have enough information to make informed decisions from year 2 forward. The principle underneath this secret is simple. Roses don't punish inaction. They punish incorrect action. A rose that's never pruned properly gets messy over time. Tangled canes, reduced air circulation, gradually smaller blooms. But it blooms. A rose pruned at the wrong moment misses its entire flowering season. Between those two outcomes, slightly messy and full of flowers beats tidy and empty every time. Put the shears down until you know what you're working with. Number 4. That rose you wrote off as dead is almost certainly alive. This is the secret I asked you to stick around for. This is the one that, once you hear it, is going to change how you respond to every struggling rose you ever encounter for the rest of your gardening life. And if you've been at this for more than a few seasons, There's a real chance this is also going to make you think about a rose you dug up and threw away before you needed to. Here's the scene. It's late winter, or it's early spring, or it's midsummer after a brutal stretch of heat. You walk out to check on your rose. The canes are brown. They're dry-looking, maybe shriveled, or dark in that distinctly lifeless way that seems to say it's over. Or maybe the damage came on faster. You had a rose that looked fine 2 weeks ago, and now half of it has collapsed. The leaves wilted and blackened as if something went through the plant overnight. You stand there looking at it, and your brain immediately starts doing the math. How much did I spend on this? How long did I try? Is it worth trying again? And then you grab a shovel. Stop. Before you ever pull another rose from the ground, do one thing first. Find a cane, any cane, doesn't matter which, and scratch through the outer bark with your fingernail. Just a light scrape, enough to get through the surface layer to the tissue underneath. Now look at the color of what you've exposed. If it's brown and dry and fibrous all the way through, that cane is genuinely dead. If it's green, even a pale, dull, muted green, that cane is alive. The plant is alive. Everything you're seeing from the outside is surface damage. Underneath that weathered bark, there is living tissue that is completely capable of producing new growth the moment conditions allow it. Once you find green, follow the cane downward, scratching every few inches. Where does the green tissue end and the dead brown begin? Find the lowest point of green and cut the cane back to about an inch or two above that point. Do this on every cane. Remove all the dead tissue, and then leave the plant alone. Water it. Keep the soil from drying out completely. Wait. What you're about to see, in the vast majority of cases, is new growth pushing from one of the remaining live buds or from the base of the plant entirely. Small, glossy, reddish shoots that are nothing but good news. That's not a comeback. That's a plant that was never as gone as it looked. Here's why this works. The root system of a rose is almost always significantly more resilient than the visible canes above ground. The canes are exposed to frost, to wind, to disease, to physical damage, to temperature swings that can swing 50 degrees between a February afternoon and a February night. But the roots are insulated by the soil. They sit in a relatively stable environment. In many cases, most cases actually, when the visible part of a rose looks completely dead, the root system is in perfectly good shape, fully charged with stored energy, waiting for a signal to push up new growth. The canes are the expendable part. The roots are the essential part. This connection loops directly back to secret number 1. When the bud union is planted below the soil surface, an additional section of the plant is protected beyond just the roots. Even if damage runs all the way down the canes to the soil line, there are still living buds sitting just underground, insulated and intact, completely ready to send up fresh canes when the time is right. You've built the rose an underground backup, a second chance that's completely invisible until you need it. There's an even more striking version of this that experienced rose growers know about and casual growers almost never see. Sometimes a rose will die back so completely that not one cane with any visible life is left above the soil. Everything is brown. You scratch every cane. All dead. You're about to call it. And then you leave the root zone alone. Water it a few times over the next few weeks, and one day you come outside to find a single shoot pushing straight up from the ground. Brand new, clean, glossy, belonging entirely to the ornamental variety, emerging directly from root or bud union tissue that was protected underground the whole time. The plant rebuilt itself from scratch. It didn't need any help. It just needed you not to dig it up. This secret asks nothing technically difficult from you. No special skills, no equipment, no expertise. It asks only for patience and a scratch test before any final decisions. Give a failing or apparently dead rose 30 days after you've cut it back to live wood. 30 days. That is a very small investment against the alternative of discarding a plant that could live for decades. The gardener who digs it up loses. The gardener who waits gets a rosebush that runs for 30, 40, sometimes 50 years. Patience costs you nothing. The alternative costs you a plant that was never actually gone, and all the seasons it would have given you if only someone had waited 30 more days to find out. Number 5, the invisible number that controls everything else. There is a variable in your soil right now, completely invisible, that may be quietly undoing every other thing you do for your roses. You can plant correctly, water deeply, prune at precisely the right time, and apply fertilizer with perfect timing, and still end up with a rose that looks persistently yellow, stunted, and fragile, because this one number is off, and everything else you do can't compensate for it. That number is your soil pH. pH measures the acidity or alkalinity of your soil on a scale from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral. Below 7 is acidic. Above 7 is alkaline. Roses want to live in a fairly specific range, roughly 6.0 to 6.5. Slightly acidic, comfortably below neutral, but not dramatically so. Most gardeners have never checked this number, not once. And in many gardens, that's fine. The soil happens to fall in a reasonable range, and the roses muddle through. But in a significant number of cases, especially in gardens with heavy clay soils, gardens that have been heavily limed at some point, or gardens near concrete foundations or new construction where alkaline materials have been mixed into the soil, the pH is quietly sitting too high. And when that happens, something very specific breaks down in how the plant accesses nutrition. Here's the mechanism. Plants don't absorb nutrients the way you might imagine. They don't simply drink them in from any wet soil. Nutrient uptake is a chemical process that depends heavily on the pH of the soil solution. When pH is in the correct range for a given plant, the nutrients in the soil exist in chemical forms that the roots can access. When pH drifts too high or too low, those same nutrients get converted into forms the roots can't take up, even if the nutrients are physically present in the soil in generous quantities. The plant starves in the middle of what should be plenty. This is the explanation for one of the most frustrating and confusing symptoms in rose growing: leaves that turn yellow between the veins, while the veins themselves stay green. This symptom, called interveinal chlorosis, is typically iron deficiency. But the iron is almost always in the soil. The problem isn't a shortage of iron, it's that the pH is too high, and the iron has been converted into a form the roots can't take in. You can pour iron supplements onto a rose growing in high pH soil and get limited results because the underlying chemistry problem is still there. The fix isn't a supplement. The fix is the pH. Checking your soil is straightforward and inexpensive. A simple test kit from any garden center will give you a reading within minutes. So will a digital pH probe pushed directly into the moist soil. You don't need to send samples to a lab, though lab tests are more accurate if you want them. The basic home test is entirely sufficient to tell you whether you're in the right range. If your pH reads too high, above 7.0, you bring it down by incorporating elemental sulfur into the soil around your rose. This isn't a quick fix. Sulfur works slowly, over the course of a growing season, as soil microbes process it. So the earlier you discover a pH problem, the better positioned you are to correct it before it costs you another year of poor performance. If your pH is too low, below 6.0, garden lime raises it, and it works somewhat faster, often showing measurable change within a few months. Here's the larger reason this secret belongs on this list. A rose growing in the right pH isn't just better fed, it's more resilient. When the soil chemistry is right and nutrients are freely available, a rose builds genuine structural strength. Thicker canes, deeper root development, denser leaf tissue. That physical strength translates directly into disease resistance. Many of the fungal issues that plague roses, black spot, powdery mildew, downy mildew, find their easiest entry into plants that are already weakened by nutritional stress. A rose that's properly nourished from the ground up simply mounts a better defense. Minor infections don't turn into major problems. The plant shrugs off the early stages of things that would devastate a nutrient-starved specimen. Check this number once, just once. That 5-minute test has the potential to explain years of mediocre performance and remove an entire category of invisible opposition from your garden. Number 6, feed after the bloom, not before it, and stop at the right time. The final secret is about fertilizing, not whether to do it, but when, and why the timing matters as much as the product. Most gardeners fertilize their roses on a rough schedule, maybe once a month, maybe whenever they happen to think about it, maybe in spring because that's when the garden center puts fertilizer on sale, and it feels like the right time to do garden things. And some of that feeding does some good, but a lot of it lands at moments when the plant isn't particularly positioned to use it, and some of it actively works against what you're trying to accomplish. Here's what's actually happening inside a repeat blooming rose across a growing season. Every time this plant produces a flush of flowers, it's drawing down its reserves. Bloom production is expensive metabolically. The plant is burning through stored sugars, minerals, and structural resources to push out those flowers. When a flush ends, when the petals drop, and the plant shifts out of active bloom, it enters a recovery and rebuilding phase. The root system ramps up its uptake activity. The plant is actively hungry, actively pulling in whatever nutrients are available, rebuilding for the next cycle. That post-bloom window is when a rose is most ready to receive and use fertilizer. Feeding at that moment is like giving a meal to someone who's just run a marathon. It gets used completely, efficiently, in direct service of the recovery and preparation for the next effort. Feeding at other moments can still do some good, but the efficiency drops substantially, and an excess of nitrogen at the wrong moment can actively push the plant in a bad direction. Lots of lush, leafy growth that looks vigorous but produces fewer flowers, and is paradoxically more attractive to aphids and more susceptible to fungal disease. The practical rhythm for repeat blooming roses looks like this. As the plant wakes up in early spring, work a layer of compost or well-rotted organic matter into the soil around the base. Not a chemical fertilizer yet, just organic material that will feed the soil biology and break down gradually over the season. This is the foundation. It doesn't push a growth surge, it builds the slow, steady nutrient availability that supports everything that follows. Then watch the plant bloom. When the first big flush peaks and the blooms begin to fade and drop, that's your signal. Cut back the spent flowers if you're deadheading, water well, and then apply a fertilizer with a balanced or slightly higher potassium and phosphorus content relative to nitrogen, something labeled for roses, or a tomato formula, which has similar requirements. Water it in deeply so the nutrients reach the root zone rather than just sitting at the surface. Within 2 to 4 weeks, you'll see the response. New shoots pushing from the cut points and the base of the plant, dense and vigorous, headed toward your next bloom flush. When that flush peaks and starts to fade, do it again. You're working in sync with the plant's own rhythm rather than imposing an external schedule on it. Here's the essential limitation, and it's one that connects directly to the health of the entire plant going into winter. Stop feeding approximately 6 to 8 weeks before your average first frost date. In most of the country, that puts your last feeding of the season somewhere in late July or August. The reason is straightforward. Fertilizer encourages new growth, and new growth, the soft young shoots produced in response to feeding, is the most frost-vulnerable tissue on the entire plant. If you're pushing new growth into September in a garden that frosts in October or November, you're setting up the most delicate parts of the rose to be caught by the cold before they've had any chance to harden off. That frost damage opens wounds that winter diseases and pests can exploit throughout the dormant season, and the plant enters spring already having paid a toll it didn't need to pay. Late July or early August, pull back. Let the plants slow naturally. Let the canes that develop through the season begin the hardening process that prepares them for winter. Your rose will be stronger for it come spring. And here's the deeper reason this secret closes out the whole list. A rose that's been fed strategically, in response to the plant's actual biological cycles rather than a calendar, builds genuine root reserves over the course of a season. Stored energy, a buffer of resources that the plant can draw on when things go wrong. When you go on vacation and come back to a heat-stressed, neglected rose in the middle of July, those root reserves are what the plant uses to bridge the gap and recover. When a surprise late frost catches new growth before it's hardened, stored energy is what fuels the recovery. When a stem disease forces a hard cutback, root reserves are what powers the regrowth. You're not just fertilizing for this summer's flowers, you're building a vault that the plant draws from every single time conditions get hard. And in the garden, conditions will always, eventually, get hard. That vault is what keeps your rose coming back. Let's step back for a moment, because when you look at all 6 of these secrets together, they stop being a list of individual tips and become something more coherent than that. They're one continuous idea. Plant the bud union below the surface, and you give your rose a protected heart that can survive almost anything that happens above ground. Water deeply and infrequently, and you build a root system that lives in cool, stable, moisture-rich soil, the kind that can shrug off summer heat and mist waterings alike. Know whether your rose blooms once or repeatedly, and you stop accidentally pruning away everything the plant was working toward. Never give up on a struggling rose without the scratch test first, because most roses that look dead aren't. They're just waiting for someone patient enough to find out. Test your soil pH at least once, because that single number may be the quiet explanation behind years of frustrating performance. And feed your rose in rhythm with its own bloom cycles, then cut that feeding off in time to let the plant harden properly before winter arrives. Put all 6 together, and the sum is bigger than the parts. You end up with a rose that isn't just surviving, it's building, getting stronger each season rather than just managing to hold on. And once a rose hits its stride with deep roots, protected bud union, well-fed reserves, and the right soil chemistry, it becomes genuinely difficult to kill. That's the neighbor's rosebush you've been looking at. Not a different variety, not a different climate, not some mysterious gardening talent you don't have. Just this information, applied season after season until the plant took hold. That's what I want for your garden. Not a garden that requires constant attention and intervention just to stay alive. A garden that rewards you disproportionately for the good decisions you make early, the deep planting, the patient watering, the correct timing, and then carries itself through the seasons that are harder, the ones where you're busy and distracted and the garden has to look after itself for a while. Roses can absolutely be that plant. They just need to be understood first. If this video shifted the way you think about roses, hit the subscribe button because this channel is built entirely around this kind of gardening, the plants with unfair reputations for being difficult, the ones that turn out to be completely approachable once someone actually explains what's happening beneath the surface. We go deep every week, and the next one is going to change how you look at another plant you've probably given up on at least once. And before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever scratched a cane on a rose you were about to throw out and found green tissue underneath? Did you save it? Or have you dug up a rose that you now suspect was still alive somewhere underground, waiting for a second chance you never gave it? Tell me what happened. I read every comment, and the experiences you share are directly shaping what I make next. Now go dig a hole, a little deeper than you think you need to. Get some compost in there, plant it right the first time, and I'll see you in the next one.